that's been outworked at the very first Passover. Now, all people who are used to teaching, so you'll understand the Passover story well. You'll understand the context of the Passover story. Directions have been given by Moses. Moses has said to his people, on this particular night, the angel of the Lord is going to pass over this particular place. And as he passes over this particular place, somebody's falling off their chair in the background, I think.
No,
as the angel of the Lord passes over this particular place, then what you have to do is place the blood of the lamb on a doorpost. If you place the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, the angel of the Lord will pass over that particular house. But for those who are not protected by the blood of the lamb, then on this particular night, the angel of the Lord is going to take the firstborn of that particular household. And we know how the thing out works. They sacrifice the lamb. They're given some very clear instructions on the preparation of the lamb. So they have to sit down together in the context of family as we see it, really. A mum, a dad, a couple of children, maybe grandmothers, and maybe one or two servants of the household. They sit down together. They eat that very first Passover lamb together. During that night, the angel of the Lord does exactly what he says he's going to do. And he passes over that particular community. Those people who are going to have the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, the angel of the Lord takes the firstborn. They wake up in the morning. There's all sorts of mayhem that takes place. But the part I want you to see is now they're going to leave Egypt, and God will say to them, I want you to celebrate this particular feast as a lasting ordinance for generations to come. So it's enshrined at that point, probably 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. It's enshrined at that point. I want you to celebrate this Passover meal, and I want you to do it in this particular way. You sacrifice the lamb as before, you prepare it as before, and then he introduces what we're going to call the liturgical element. And the liturgical element into this particular feast is the youngest child in the household during this particular celebration of Passover stands and asks this question: what makes this night special? That's all they have to do. The youngest member of the household asks that liturgical question. We're going to call it a liturgical question. It's a set of words that the rabbis give lots of extra information about. And they ask the question. Then mum or dad stands and explains exactly what makes that night special. We were slaves in a land that was not our own, and God, through a miracle, led us out, parted the Red Sea, led us into a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that could be our own. The entire thing is constructed in such a way as to communicate the concept of the God who does stuff. If you've heard me speak before, you'll hear me talk again and again about the communication of the God who does stuff, and that's been communicated. But what I want you to see is it's communicated in a liturgical context. I would like to step almost beyond the word liturgy for this. It's almost choreography or almost high drama. It involves the whole family. It couldn't get much more traditional. It's thousands of years old, this particular sequence of events that's taking place. And everyone is involved. They're either listening to the narrative taking place, they're one of the people asking the question, or they're one of the people making the response to the question that's being asked. So 3,000 years ago, we've got what is in effect a very traditional scene, a feast that's going to be continue to happen year after year after year after year. And this year again, in a month or so, Jewish households will celebrate Passover. The youngest child will stand up, will ask what makes this night special. The mum or the dad will explain it.
And that entire thing has been running for thousands and thousands of years. So what I want you to see is it couldn't be much more traditional than that. This is thousands of years of tradition being outworked, but it isn't devalued in any way because it's old. Now, it continues to resonate with new generations as they rise, because the entire thing is constructed in such a way as to communicate the God who does stuff. It's communicating in the context of intergenerational gathering, and it's communicated with all members of the family being involved. It's truly inclusive and hugely traditional. So our question, can intergenerational worship exist in a traditional context? Absolutely. It's been existing in that context for thousands of years. But what we have to do is hang on to some of the things which make this thing so incredibly special, and not strip it back to the point where it no longer has value and can no longer communicate for us. So this word liturgy is the word which actually, it would cause me a struggle as well, and is causing me a struggle at this present moment in time. It's why I want to opt out and say, actually, what I'm talking about is almost choreography, is almost high drama, it's theatre being outworked. Liturgy in its own right is almost not enough anymore. So I work for the Anglican Church in Wales, which is a strongly liturgical denomination. It prides itself on its liturgy. It says we hold on to this firm liturgy. It has now become countercultural because other people don't do this. I am always worried by the terms countercultural, because often they are there to mask the reality, which is we're not countercultural, we're just completely irrelevant. And we just use the wrong words to try and camouflage what's actually taking place. And so we have a strongly liturgical tradition that sees itself as countercultural because society isn't quite doing it that way anymore. Yesterday, I trained some of the Church in Wales ministers now, and my particular part of the equation is I also am responsible for the newly licensed ministers. So the first 2 years, when they move into a new church, for the first 2 years, I get to look after what they do and try and shape some of the formation as part of that. That's combined with another role I have for the development of children and youth work across Wales as well. But trying to get across to them that actually not all things that have been done for thousands of years are relevant and worthwhile now. And of course, when it comes to liturgy, it's not a product of thousands of years. It's the product of the Enlightenment. It's the product of Thomas Cranmer. It's the product of the Book of Common Prayer. And all those things which lots of traditional denominations have built their framework upon. But it's important to recognize when he was writing. When Robert Raikes came to form the Sunday schools, there was a strong emphasis on liturgy, strong emphasis on words. His catechisms were very strong in terms of liturgy. There was a sentence read by the teacher, the students responded with the next line, and that drifted into the church and became part of Anglican confirmation services. The asking of a question, the memorization of an answer, which became quite a strong liturgical thing, and has continued for hundreds of years. This week, just for the sheer fun of it, although I didn't enjoy it at all, in our little college for training ministers, we did the 1662 Holy Communion service. The worrying part, and the part I wanted to be able to emphasize from it, is look how similar it is to what we're still doing. Now, when the Enlightenment took place, it brought about a massive change in culture. It moved culture from an oral tradition to a written tradition. It moved us from valuing the gifted orator, and it moved us to valuing words on a page. Those who sold newspapers in the 18th century became incredibly powerful. No coincidence that Robert Raikes, the founder of the Sunday schools, was the owner of a newspaper. His credibility was huge. His ability to propagate his product was based on his control and his command of lots and lots of words, what was written down. And there are instances where Robert Raikes was summoned to the Houses of Parliament to answer to the government of the day because he criticised Parliament in his newspaper. I think if that was still the same scenario today, we would have some newspaper editors who would never leave Parliament. They would be constantly there apologising for the things that they've written about Brexit and all sorts of other interesting things that we've got taking place. But the words, it's the words that's powerful. Therefore, at that point, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the words are incredibly powerful. Liturgy is strong. If you can read the words and recite the words, then it's a powerful thing to be able to do. It's a sign that you are educated. And so what happens is liturgical traditions, certainly in the British context, liturgical traditions are full of educated people. So to be able to actually use liturgy and interact with liturgy and use liturgy is actually a sign of social status. And so this thing drifts into the church. And the incredible thing is it stays. Now what happens is, in terms of culture, modernism peaks as a result of the Enlightenment. The written word becomes incredibly important. Everybody owns books. Bibles are printed in huge numbers. And modernism peaks. And modernism peaks probably in the mid-1800s. So an awfully long time ago now, modernism peaks. And from its peak, it then begins to descend. So the onset of this strange, weird thing that we're terming postmodern begins around about 1850. It's really not a new idea. And the whole concept of postmodernism means we're no longer in modernism, but of course we don't know how to label this thing, so we'll call it postmodern. And the crazy people are now talking about postmodern. Well, I just think they will get a little bit more creative with their terms, would be a little bit more useful. But it's really quite difficult to recognize the culture that you swim in. So we can look back and say that's when modernism began, that's when modernism ended. But what we can't do is that same thing with postmodern, because that's the stuff we're swimming in now. The clever philosopher statement, we don't know who discovered the water, but it probably wasn't fish. So it's very, very hard to recognize the stuff that you actually swim in. So we don't know what we're in right now, but what we should be able to do is look at the characteristics of culture, look at some of the attributes of it, and there are clever ones. And we talk about the clever ones. We talk about Generation Y and Generation Z, about them being community focused and relationship focused, and we get all that. But there's a much more basic change which happened even before we hit Generation X, and that was the decline of that whole modernism thing. And the result of the decline is the written word, which was so incredibly powerful, is no longer powerful. The written word, which was authoritative, is no longer authoritative. And so if you read a newspaper in 1800, you'd believe every word that was written down because it's printed. If you read a newspaper in 2019, you don't believe any of it. You don't trust what's written down anymore. And what's happened is culture itself has moved away from modernism into postmodernism, it's moved away from the importance of that which was written, and it's moved back towards the importance of that which is oral. So the gifted orator at this point in history becomes incredibly valuable again. The most powerful way we can communicate right now, 21st century, is to put a person in front of a crowd and let them talk. And all the stuff flies in the face of that. Barna's research says if it doesn't have technology behind it, it's not effective. Not true anymore. The way to communicate is an individual who stands in front of a crowd and talks. The gifted orator has come back into its own. Now, look what that does to liturgical worship. Look what that does when we prize the word, we love the word, and we read out our words, and the Lord is here. His Spirit is with us, is how we start the traditional Anglican Eucharistic prayer. It does not connect with society anymore. They don't understand why that. So what we've done is we've created something which is predominantly for the insider, because the insider finds comfort and security in it because it's familiar. But what we've done is we've developed something which is very hard to break into, and we're struggling with that big time in terms of the Anglican Church in Wales right now, because our services are predominantly liturgical, very strongly liturgical, and we're using. I brought my big red book to show you. So we're using this thing at the moment, and it's just full of words. And because we're in that learning context, my students wanted me to use Eucharistic Prayer 7 the other day so they could see what it was like. And the heading for Eucharistic Prayer 7 is suitable for use when a significant number of 7 to 11-year-olds are present. So we've created a service which is packed full of words, which is designed for 7 to 11-year-olds, which is longer than the adult version. So I did it for them, and in my reflection back to them afterwards, I said to them, I've never had to use a Eucharistic prayer written by demons before, because this is clearly from hell. My feedback's usually honest and upfront, and good for them to hear, but it's words, tons and tons of words, and that's not connecting. So we have to try and work out, okay, if our liturgy is not the way forward, however, with choreography and high theatre, we can still embrace lots of generations in the same place at the same time. What actually becomes the way forward? There are a couple of things which work, and it doesn't matter which context that you find yourselves in. And we have to ask ourselves great, big, important, fundamental questions. Question number one, is it inclusive? Is everyone actually involved? Whoa, somebody's just come back on with a bit of sound in the background there. Is it inclusive? Is everyone involved? And listen, I have a little bit of a problem with the form of worship which has become compartmentalized. This is the children's bit, this is the adult bit, and this is for granny. That's not intergenerational worship. That's 3 different worship services that just happen consecutively. So we have to find a way. So is everyone involved? Is it inclusive? And they don't have to all be the person who are sat and listening. It doesn't have to be all the persons who are involved in the speaking or the reading or the praying or the acting. I have a lovely story about when I went to my last new church, and I preached my very first sermon, and the sound person was 10 years of age, because that's the only people who know how to work those things now. And the 10-year-old walked up and he held his hand out to take my radio mic off me. And he said to me these words. He said, "You sounded rubbish this morning." That was altogether alarming for me to hear. And I said, "Oh, sorry, I was doing my best. He said, no, not what you said, just the microphone and the speakers. It made you sound rubbish this morning. And so he took my microphone off me and he tried to walk away, but I wasn't letting him walk away. I brought him back and said, so listen, how can you make me not sound rubbish? How do you do that? And he said, well, we need a new microphone and we need some new speakers. And my comment to him was, can you go and find out what we need to do to make me sound like Tom Jones next week? And so he scratched his head a little bit and said, well, we'll need new this and new that. And I said to him, listen, work it out. Find out what we need. Make sure that this is sounding great by the time we get to next week. Can you do that for me? And so suddenly you have an engaged 10-year-old. He's involved. Now, this is not about great communication at the front. This is about all the aspects of church involving everyone. That was on Sunday morning. When I went to leave the house that Sunday evening, there was a letter through the door, and he had typed out an entire list of everything that we needed to make Mark Griffiths sound good. And he'd listed it all. There was a line at the bottom which said exactly how much that entire thing was going to cost, and it really wasn't a lot. And we did it. We bought this new list. Now there's a young person who's now involved. He's completely committed to this particular thing. Now this works in ridiculous ways in all sorts of other churches. But this person's not going to leave. He bought the sound equipment. In other churches, that person's not going to leave because their great-great-granny donated the offering bowl. It's the same idea. They're involved and they have an emotional investment in this entire thing. So the question was, is it inclusive? Is everyone involved? Is everyone involved through the whole thing? And some of our young people do not like to sit still for long. They like to be doing. So are there things that they can be doing to facilitate the happenings of the whole thing? Those of you who know me, I also am not very good at sitting still for very long. So I also need to find things to do. So I completely understand those who are the kinetic learners and you just can't cope with sitting there for too long. So we have to ask ourselves the question, is it inclusive? The second thing is, worship is not the main thing. We think it's all about this, the preaching and the singing and the reading, and they are not the main things. If we've made them the main things, we've become a slave to the institutionalization of church, and we kind of have to strip those things back. So really, it's not about the style of worship, whether we're singing Charles Wesley hymns or we're singing Bethel worship. It's not about either of those two things. It's actually about something far deeper than that. It's actually about that sense of belonging that I have in this particular community, in this particular place. So words like community and belonging become far more significant and far more important than the style and the mechanisms of our worship which is taking place. You'll not be that tuned into this, but I lived in England for 30 years, but I'm actually from about 25 miles north of where I am now in Cardiff. So I grew up in a Welsh valley. And my Welsh Valley is a wonderful place. Post-industrial, I grew up with a very large coal mine in the back garden, not far from the back garden actually, maybe 100 meters from the back garden, and a very close-knit community, which does strange and bizarre things to this day. So the street that I grew up in, my dad still lives there. My sister bought the house next door to my dad. I have cousins who moved in across the street. And the rest of the street, oh, somebody popping in, the rest of the street is also made up of the very first person who lived there and all her children who then had their children. So not a lot of actual different families. In that particular area, I still to this day have 46 cousins. So it's all very intermingled, all very interwoven. But it does community hugely well. And Welsh Valleys do community hugely well. But what I want you to see is the nature of the way that it does community. So when things don't go so well for me, I can escape back to my little Welsh Valley. I can go back there and I can belong. I get to belong, not because of anything I've done. So in my little Welsh Valley, my PhD means absolutely nothing at all. My books mean nothing at all. My reverend status means nothing at all. In fact, I still don't really have a name in that little Welsh Valley. I am Martin's boy. They know me as Martin's boy. I think I might get a name when my dad dies. But until that point, I'll just be his son in that particular place. When I go back there, it's the most extraordinary thing. I went to the pub with my dad, and on my visit to the pub with my dad wanted to refresh my memory about all the people that I'm supposed to know. And he said, that's Craig, you went to school with Craig, and that's Donna, she's now married to Craig. And then Donna shakes her head and my dad says, oh, not married to Craig, okay, just living with Craig. And then he moves around the room and he says, okay, this is Tina, and Tina is married to the drug dealer. You know the drug dealer. And I'm looking horrified at that point. And he says, oh, no, it's okay, because he doesn't sell his drugs around here. And so that was the rationale for that being okay. But the reality was, whether he was the person who was living with Donna or whether he was the person who was the drug dealer, everybody got to belong because, not because of what they've done, but simply because of who they are. And it's curious that the most recent research says the number one reason a person will join a new church community is not the quality of the preaching, it's not how great the worship is, it's not even how wonderful our work with children and young people is. The number one reason a person will join a new community is the quality of the welcome. So it's all about, does this person feel welcome in this particular place? And if they feel welcome in that particular place, the other things become subservient to that whole thing. Let me pause a second. Can you ask Elliot not to put the internet on? It's just flashed up here. I think somebody. Oh, okay, no worries. If you can still hear me, please nod. My computer just flashed up an internet warning. Oh, we're all okay. Wonderful. So the quality of belonging becomes more important than anything else. And the quality of belonging is more important than which songs we choose to sing. The quality of belonging becomes more important than how great is the preacher at the front. So everyone needs to belong. Now, please hear, therefore, if you run the sort of church service which pulls the children out at the start so they never set foot in the main worship space, how therefore can they ever establish a sense of belonging to that particular place? And if they do establish a sense of belonging to that particular place, that sense of belonging will override everything else and become more important than everything else. So we have to establish that sense of belonging. We were at a worship service last week, me and my 16-year-old Elliot, and it really wasn't the most inspiring worship in the entire world. And at one point, he nudged me and said to me, "Have they never heard of Joel Houston here?" We laughed. They never had. But he puts up with the service because they embrace him and there's a sense of belonging. So the fact that they make him feel as part of that place is more important than the fact that they haven't managed to sing a song that was written more recently than 1903. So that manages to get past that part. So we have to think that. The third part in this is it real? Is what we're trying to do authentic? Or is it a performance piece? Are we just trying to put on a show? So that whole thing about is it real becomes so incredibly important. And you can see it. So I have a bunch of students who are practicing to lead worship. And you can see the difference when actually they're leading us in worship and when they're practicing worship. They have to do this particular service because they have to learn how to do this. Well, there's no authenticity in that. There's no integrity in that. It's not real. And therefore that whole thing doesn't work. It doesn't join up properly. It doesn't hang together properly. It's not the gifted orator standing in front of the crowd. It's somebody who isn't being true to themselves, trying to do something which doesn't actually fit. There's a lovely story in this. You'll all know this. There's a lovely story about the whole being real thing, and the being real thing is incredibly important as we try and rebuild. We have, as in most of the Western world, we have hugely declining numbers, and it's due to the fact that people don't meet something which is authentic when they come to our services. There's a lovely little story. I'll read it to you, a little bit of it. It's from the Velveteen Rabbit, and you'll know this story well, I'm sure. And it goes like this. Real isn't how you are made, said the Skin Horse. It's a thing that happens to you when a child loves you for a long, long time. Not just to play with, but really loves you. Then, and only then, do you become real. Does it hurt? Asked the Rabbit. Sometimes, said the Skin Horse, for he was always truthful. But when you are real, you don't mind being hurt. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up? He asked. Or is it bit by bit? Well, it doesn't happen all at once, said the Skin Horse. You become. And it takes a long, long time. That's why it doesn't often happen to people who break easily or who have sharp edges or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off and your eyes drop out and you get loose in the joints and you become very shabby indeed. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly except to people who don't understand. And there's a magic in the ability to be real. And you see it when that person stands at the front to communicate to that crowd, and you know that they're not a great communicator. And they're breaking all the rules of communication. They're not doing it properly, and they're not telling the story, and and you listen to all these things, and yet every person in the room hangs on their every word. Whether they're the youngest child or the oldest grandmother, they're all hanging on their word. Why? Because the person has an ability to communicate who they are from their heart. And the power of authenticity shouldn't be overlooked. The ability to be real. And so we need some people who, and again, doesn't matter if it's termed a contemporary service or a traditional service. If the person at the front is not real, it will not communicate. If the person at the front is real, they will communicate, even if they get some of the things wrong. if they actually put themselves out there, the professionalization of the ministry is a curse. We need real people who communicate from very real hearts. It's the difference between hiding behind a set of words when we break bread together, we have lots of Eucharistic prayers, and the person who stands at the front and holds the bread and said, in the night that he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and he broke it and he gave it to his disciples, and a person who breaks pieces of bread and hands them out, and he said, this is my body which is broken for you. In the same way, after supper, he takes a cup. Now you'll find all these exact same words written down as liturgy, but the ability to present them intergenerationally in a theatre is altogether more powerful, and it connects in a far more special and authoritative way. The wonderfully interesting thing is Jesus was not a great preacher. I say those words with absolute authority because I've got several books titled The Book of Great Preachers, and Jesus isn't in any of them. Wesley is in them, and Whitfield is in them, and Charles Finney is in them, and John Stott is in the more recent ones, but Jesus isn't in because he wasn't a great preacher, and that I found that quite troubling. My theological college report from quite some time back says of me, Mark is not a great preacher, which was quite alarming because I hold a crowd perfectly well. And then it's got afterwards, almost as an afterthought, but we would say he's a very good communicator. And it's that professionalization thing that we kind of have to break free from. So the ability of the person who can stand at the front and not aim to be the great preacher in that traditional sense. And Britain still has a lot of those sorts of churches where it's very well polished, preach on a particular Sunday morning using a very ancient formula of introduction and 3 points and a conclusion. And you know how this goes. And the great preacher stands and says they're going to talk about love, and there are 3 Greek words for love, and they begin to explain their Greek words for love, but nobody's listening, and that's the opposite of intergenerational. That's no generational. Nobody at all is listening to what's actually being said. Why? Because this is the 21st century. You got an introduction which told you 3 Greek words, and that's enough for you, thank you. Because it's just not interesting for adults, let alone anybody else. And I think we may just be missing that particular twist in this tale. In our desire to try and work out what's intergenerational, I think we might have overlooked the fact that the adult at the front talking to the adults in front of them is also not communicating. So that single generation are not listening to the person at the front either. So it's a whole new set of skills and tricks and abilities. Jesus wants to talk about love. This is Jesus, the not very good preacher, wants to talk about love and says, a certain man's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho when he falls into the hands of thieves and robbers. And everyone in the crowd is with him. And they go, well, that was going to happen, wasn't it? If you walk on that road from Jerusalem to Jericho, he was bound to end up in trouble. Why on earth did he go that way? And all those listeners, and they stripped him of his clothes. And they go, oh, because they know if you take away somebody's clothes, you take away their identity. You don't know now whether they're a Jew or an Arab or a Samaritan. They don't know. They've taken away their identity. But the listeners to Jesus' story are actually picking up on the subtle little nuances that he's placed inside his story. The priest comes by, sees the man, walks by on the other side of the road. The crowd are laughing so much, they're crying. Why? Because they know it's a single path leading from Jerusalem to Jericho. To cross by on the other side of the road is like a scene from Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, where the rock has disappeared, and then Wile E. Coyote realizes the rock is gone and then falls straight down. It's that kind of scenario that Jesus is painting. The priest crosses over onto thin air and whoosh, disappears. It's really funny. Jesus is rather brilliant at this. He's never going to get into the book of great communicators, but he is rather brilliant at this. So it's important to recognize how being real in front of the intergenerational crowd is. And then doesn't matter about the style of worship. It's almost an irrelevant question. Style of worship, it's got nothing to do with anything. And so I've got to talk in lots of different flavors of church. It doesn't matter. It's the other things which are making the thing work. Is it real? Do I belong? Is it inclusive? These are the things which are actually making the thing work. Singing Charles Wesley is completely irrelevant. Singing Chris Tomlin is completely irrelevant. Singing Graham Kendrick is almost a punishment, so I have to draw the line somewhere. But those things are important to bear in mind. Our big churches, so this is not about traditional or not traditional, our big churches are dropping the ball on this. They're dropping the ball because they've bought into a methodology which says adults go into this room and children go into this room. They're dropping the ball on it, and they're not even aware that they're dropping the ball on it. So you have children who've never experienced that sense of belonging. They've never experienced that sense of inclusivity. They've never experienced that sense of it being real. And of course, we've got all that gorgeous stuff from Fuller Seminary, which says there's no such thing as a silver bullet when it comes to transitioning children into adult church. But if there were one, it's children having the ability to see adults worship. And we've taken that away. The problem with our larger churches, certainly I can only speak about our context, the problem with the larger churches is they don't even notice it's a problem, because they've always got 200 children in their children's ministry. But what they're not recognizing is it's 200 different children every 3 years, and the ones who leave the children's ministry don't go anywhere else. They never transition. But while it's always looking like big church, then they never are concerned or worried about the thing. And what we have is large numbers who've never seen an adult worship. They've never connected with Jesus themselves. They have a vicarious relationship with Jesus lived out through somebody else. And they never have the ability to engage. And we lose them. And they drift away. And the story across the world is of us not being able to do the transition well. But we don't do the transition because we don't make it easy. Now, the difficulty is big church looks like successful church. And when you buy into the model that says big church is successful church, and then you hear the explanation, well, we'd never be able to get all the children and the adults in together, would we? And of course, the thought of getting a bigger space hasn't occurred to them, or splitting their service in two hasn't occurred to them. Their way of doing it is therefore to carve out adults and children. That buys into the problem. And our difficulty is, actually our smaller churches are far more effective at this, but we don't think they're successful because they're not big churches. And we have to rethink that whole way of working. And we've got some really sad situations at the moment where some of our leaders of our very large churches are saying, why don't my own children want to come anymore? Well, it's not a case of want them to come anymore. They've never been into the thing that they call the main worship centre. They've never set foot in there. So we've never had the opportunity to equip them for all the stages which come next. And they've never had an opportunity to see their parents worship, even though their parents are the leaders of the church. So it's a tragic scenario, except we think these particular leaders, this is why everyone's surprised, because these particular leaders are the heroes because they lead one of the largest churches. But if you run a model which works that other way, it gets problematic. And maybe, and this is wild, maybe we have to think, actually, there is a size that our churches shouldn't be beyond before we plant another one. There is a size in which we can do belonging, we can do authenticity, we can do real. And when we stretch beyond that particular thing, maybe it breaks. And therefore, some of our gorgeous churches, certainly in the Church of Wales, are the ones that will have 9 old people up on a hill somewhere and 2 or 3 young people have wandered in. And what they've discovered is they don't really like the songs, but they've found the most embracing community you can imagine. And some of our best ministers have come through scenarios like that. Nothing dynamic about the church, nothing great about the church, but they've embraced them. These spiritual parents have done their job so well that they come out the other side as gold. Now we're never listing them as great churches. They have a dozen old people on a hill, but when they do their job, they do it really well. So I think we might have been tapping into the wrong value system, and we may need to think through that whole thing. Boys and girls will cope perfectly well with singing "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing." They will cope with that, and that great grandmother will cope perfectly well with "Our God is a great big God." It's not about worship styles. It is sometimes about communication, but not in the sense of how is it possible to communicate to everybody? Because of course Jesus, the not very good preacher, was able to communicate to the very old grandmother or grandfather, to the new couple, to the little boy who wanders up and said, "I've got a fish and a couple of loaves. Is that going to work?" And so he can do the whole thing. So there isn't a problem with that either. But we just have to rethink our value system, and we have to, I think, rethink the whole thing. I think our ecclesiology at this point in the 21st century is completely up for grabs. And I tell my students now, if you would strip the whole thing back, please tell me that Jesus didn't break into time and space, live a sinless life, die an horrific death, resurrect from the dead, ascended and sits at the right hand of the Father, so that we could sit on a pew on Sunday morning. Please tell me it wasn't about that. And I just cannot believe that the whole thing was about the development of an institution. And I think it, and when I ask them that, it takes them ages to work out what the thing was actually for. They scratch their heads and they wonder, and they get a little bit upset by the fact that there's not a lot of records of any of the disciples singing Graham Kendrick songs, for obvious reasons. And there's none, it's not there. And so eventually they get to the point and they say, it's about making disciples, isn't it? And I go, Eureka. It is. And therefore, if we actually work it the other way around, is what we have the best way to make disciples? We've got this great big church and it's got 800 people in, and it's got 500 children in, it's got 300 young people in. And is it making disciples? Because that's the thing that we're supposed to be doing. Is that the machine that we want to use to make disciples? Well, actually, it's not doing it. It's typically gathering people who were already in. It's providing very nice services for the insider, but it's not missional, it's not evangelistic, it's not about the transformation of all human life under God, and it's not making disciples. So we've got to ask ourselves the big questions at that point. Is the whole thing up for grabs? So your initial question, which I mentioned about 3.5 hours ago, it feels, can intergenerational worship exist in a more liturgical, traditional version of church? Actually, I want to reevaluate our entire concept of church. I'm not worried about our preaching, because that's not why your people are joining. And I'm not worried about the style of worship, because that's not why people are coming. If somebody would unpick it, actually, the quality of the coffee and the availability of donuts has more to do with attendance than the actual worship set that morning. And I know that's horrific to hear, but it is the reality. So people are joining because they want to belong. I have definitely stopped now, because that's enough talking from me. Is that okay?